Well, today we're moving from 8-bit to 16! During the last episodes, we talked a little bit about the origins of the Legend of Zelda series and the first two games in the series. It started off with just a simple concept of an elf boy trying to rescue a princess in a mystical land of Hyrule, and was followed up by a much different, though no less fun, game bearing the Zelda title. However, as with any medium, competition was on the rise. More powerful systems were beginning to emerge from rival companies. The TurboGrafx-16 and the Sega Genesis were beginning to make their appearances, which threatened Nintendo's dominance in the gaming market. So Nintendo put their heads together and decided to make a new console. The answer was the Super NES, a more powerful 16-bit system that would inevitably give the competitors a run for their money. So of course, with the advent of a new console, Nintendo began bringing in their poster child, Mario, featuring him in a brand new platformer, Super Mario World, several compilation cartridges such as Super Mario All-Stars, and spin-off games similar to Dr. Mario, such as Super Mario Kart. And of course, there was one other franchise that Nintendo gladly transferred over to their new 16-bit system. Released in 1991 in Japan and 1992 in America, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past took the gaming world by storm, and fans of the series rejoiced in seeing a return to form. It was much more like the original game, but everything was bigger, brighter, and better. The first real interesting factor in this game is its story. While the basic formula remains the same from the first and second games, this is the first game that truly tells us the history of Hyrule, how the original goddesses created it and left behind a symbol of their power, the Triforce, a huge powerful object that in a golden land had the ability to grant the wishes of anybody who touched it. And it was touched by none other than Ganondorf Dragmir, also known as Ganon, who has been the main antagonist of the series since its inception. The story also tells us how Ganon was sealed away in the Dark World by 7 sages, but hundreds of years later, an evil wizard named Agnim, who is working for Ganon, takes over Hyrule Castle and is using the 7 sages' descendants, who happen to be 7 maidens, to try and break the seal and let Ganon and his minions roam Hyrule once again. This intensive narrative and much more polished backstory was not only a great way to show the leap that games had made in recent years, but also set the stage for what was going to be one of the grandest adventures on the Super Nintendo. Even the way the game starts is far more epic than any of the games that came before it. Instead of plopping you down in a field somewhere or starting you off at a temple where a sleeping maiden lies, Zelda directly contacts Link via telepathy while he's asleep in bed, telling him of Agnim's plan and where she's being held. Aside from introducing the player to the character they would be controlling, this is also the first instance where Zelda is really given a character beyond the trope of damsel in distress in the series. True, her part is not very large in this story, but it's certainly far more important than just being the object of your search like she was in the first two games. In fact, you rescue her right off the bat at the beginning of the game. While she does eventually devolve into just being another damsel in distress, her introduction in this way does give her character a much deeper meaning. And this is something that would be explored in more games as the series would progress. But for right now, it's just a nice touch to what was originally a very bland formula that had been invented pretty much by Mario. What's also interesting about this game is that it establishes for the first time that Link actually has family. True, his uncle isn't in the game for very long and really only exists to give you your sword and shield, but in later games in the series, as we'll see, Link does have relatives in varying degrees, and this was the first game that really established that. While there were several other minor tweaks to the series, there were two other main themes that would recur through pretty much every other game in the series that were first introduced here. The first of which is the introduction of Link's mighty sword, the Master Sword, the Sword of Evil's Bane. The other main innovation is the fact that the first three dungeons of this game feel more like a precursor to the real adventure rather than a part of the main quest. They're still very important, but they serve a much different purpose rather than the rest of the game. It's only after you beat Agnim, one of the game's main antagonists, that the real adventure begins. On a technical level, pretty much everything that could be improved was improved. Link's world was now bigger, better, and brighter. His controls were a lot less stiff. He was able to move diagonally, and he could also jump down from high places and dash. The isometric view also gave the game a much more realistic feel to it, while still retaining the bright and colorful whimsy of the Fantasy Zelda series. Every screen of the game looks very distinct, and the fact that you can access a map from pretty much anywhere in the overworld was a godsend in helping you find your way around, and when trying to backtrack to places you had already been. It made the whole game a little bit easier, but on the whole much more fulfilling as well. Of course, the dungeons were improved as well. No longer were they simple one-floor, symmetrical affairs with very similar rooms. There were multiple rooms and multiple floors, and pretty much all of them had a very distinct look and feel to them. There were long hallways, traps, and plenty of different enemies. The bosses were also much improved from the first two games as well. As I mentioned in my last video, the bosses in the original Legend of Zelda were not really given any real flair, and in fact became regular enemies near the end of the game. There was no real majesty to them. The bosses in Zelda 2 were much better. They did actually feel like bosses, but on the whole they didn't really have that scare factor that a lot of other bosses here have. In these games, however, these bosses will scare the crap out of you, and every battle is a monumental event. And of course, as the dungeon's difficulty escalates, so does that of the boss. In fact, this boss here wouldn't be too much of a problem, except for the fact that you're fighting in a wall-less arena. If you get too close to the edge, or if the boss closes in on you, he can actually push you off to the edge, which doesn't cause any damage, but it sends you back down to the floor below, effectively forcing you to restart the boss fight every time you fall. Link's inventory was also